Good afternoon, everyone. This is the first lecture for week 2 of Pacific Northwest plant identification. And this week we're going to be reviewing some important terms to describe flowers and the vegetative morphology of plants. And this is going to help you to memorize some terminology and get to know some terminology that will be helpful for plant identification. So let's review some of the basic anatomy. I'll start by reminding you to look for these symbols throughout the lecture to test your understanding of various concepts. So let's start with the parts of a flower. I will expect you to be able to memorize the basic structure of a flower and the 4 whorls of a flower. So starting from the outside and moving in, we start at the base of the flower. The pedicel is the stalk of the flower, and a bract is a small leaf-like structure that subtends a flower. Moving up from the pedicel, we have the receptacle, and that's the point at which all of the 4 whorls of the flowers attach. So the outermost whorl of the flower is referred to as the sepals. Collectively, we refer to the sepals as the calyx, and these function as protection for the flower. They're often green, and much like a leaf, but they can also be the same color as the petals. The next whorl is the petals, and collectively they're called corolla. Together, the petals and the sepals are sometimes referred to as the perianth. The petals' role is attraction. So they're going to help attract pollinators to the flower. Often they're scented or colored. The next whorl, we begin to look at the reproductive structures of the flower. First, with the male parts, referred to as the andrecium, or the stamen. Together, the stamen is made up of a filament, which is the stalk, and an anther, which is the pollen-bearing organ of the flower. And the innermost whorl is called the pistil, or the gynecium. This is the female reproductive structure. The pistil consists of the ovary. The ovary contains the ovules. The ovary develops into a mature fruit, and the ovules develop into seeds. The stalk of the pistil is referred to as the style, and the tip of the pistil is referred to as the stigma. And this is the receptive surface that pollen lands on, that pollen tubes will grow down to fertilize individual ovules. So those are the basic roles of the flower: the sepal, the petal, the stamen, and the pistil. And you should be able to notice this in any flower. Not all flowers have all 4 whorls, as you'll get to know. You can watch this video where a flower is dissected and the parts are labeled. Here's a lily. We can see that the petals and the sepals look very similar in a lily. When we have identical looking petals and sepals in 2 whorls, we can call them tepals together, tepals with a T. Lilies are monocot, so they have whorls of 3 sepals and 3 petals. Then we have the pedicel, which is the stalk of the flower. Moving in, if you were to remove some of these sepals and petals, you'd be able to see the receptacle where the flower parts are attached. You'd be able to see the stamen with the filament and the anther. And you'd be able to see the pistil with the ovary, the style, and the stigma. Now, flowers can be arranged in what we call inflorescence or clusters, and there's many different kinds of clusters or inflorescence types. And so this is a great term for you to become familiar with, because you'll have to look these up as these will be often mentioned in your keying exercises. So these little red drawings are really helpful because they show us the important features of these different inflorescence types. And so a panicle has flowers that are attached that have stalks. So like the flowers are not sessile, like a spike, or see in this one, the flowers are borne in the axes of these little bracts. So they're directly attached to the stem, that's sessile. Here that the flowers have their own stems, and often the stems are branching. So in a panicle, we have stems with branches and multiple flowers on them. And the size of the flowers here is indicating that there's timing where the flowers will mature at different stages in a panicle. So the spike, as I mentioned, is a sessile flowers borne directly in the axes of the main stalk. And a raceme is where you have stalked flowers, but there's only one at the tip of each stalk. Now we have a corm and an umbel. So a corm and an umbel are similar in that they have flowers that are borne in clusters that kind of, when you look straight on at them, are in kind of a row across. However, you'll notice that in the corm, the stalks of the individual flowers are alternate to one another. So the stalks are longer at the bottom and shorter at the top, whereas a simple umbel is coming from one attachment point and the flowers are arranged horizontally from that single attachment point. You can also have a compound umbel where each of the main flowering stalks comes to another point where we have another set of stalks before the flowers occur. This would be an example of like Queen Anne's lace. And then we have a head. We talked about the composite head of the Asteraceae family in my first lecture, and then catkins, which are inflorescence that droop or hang downward with clusters that are borne off of a main stem. So take a few minutes, look at these pictures, and you can refer back to the drawings from the last page and try to determine which each of these flowering plants, which category of inflorescence would they fit into. Okay, some other important features of a flower include whether they have all of their sexual parts or whether one whorl of their sexual parts is missing. So a flower is thought to be perfect if it has both the stamen and the pistil, okay? Or the carpel is the other word for the pistil. They're imperfect if they're missing or lacking either the male or the female part. So this is an imperfect flower that is lacking in the stamens, for example. Another term that's often used besides perfect and imperfect is what we call complete and incomplete. A complete flower has all four whorls, the sepals, the petals, the stamens, and the pistil. An incomplete flower is missing one or more whorls. So you can have a incomplete perfect flower, but you cannot have a complete imperfect flower. So let that sink in for a minute. This is just showing you for imperfect flowers, you might hear them referred to as staminate or carpellate, or pistillate, for example, where you have only female. A bisexual or hermaphroditic flower is a perfect flower that has both male and female. And a staminate flower would be another imperfect flower with just the male parts. Another term that you might hear applied to plants involves whether or not their flowers are borne on individual plants or the same plant. They're male and sexual flowers. So in the case of monoecious plants, this literally translates to one house. So on each plant, you have both male and female flowers. They're on different, that the male and female flowers are imperfect, meaning that they're separate flower types. But here you can see the male catkin hanging down that has the pollen, and then the female catkin over here. This would be in the Betulaceae family, like alder, for example. Whereas willows are dioecious. Their flowers are imperfect and they're borne on totally different plants. So you can have a male plant, a male willow plant with stamens, and a female willow plant. And Dr. Carrie Leroy at Evergreen, who's a stream ecologist, is actually studying the sex of willows and their preponderance around streams, where she's found that female willows live closer to streams than male willows in Mount St. Helens, where we're seeing the early succession of plant communities after the volcanic eruption of Mount St. Helens, and how these plant communities develop over time. So another feature and term that you're going to come across for floral terminology in keying is called placentation. This term comes from the word placenta. And basically, if you were to do a cross-section of an ovary, plant ovary, the ovules are attached in a variety of different manners called the placentation. So in parietal placentation, you have the ovules attached to the outer ovary wall with an open chamber inside. With axial, instead of having a completely open chamber, you have these interior walls, and the ovules are attached within the axes of these interior walls in the center. With free central, you have one open chamber with a kind of a pole in the middle. You can see that here with the ovules attached to the center. And there's also more than these three, but these would be the most common placentation types. And so if you come across these terms in your key, you'll know that you need to look them up. Okay, so there's different kinds of floral symmetry, right? So you might hear the term radially symmetrical. That means that if any way you cut the flower, it looks the same. The other word for radial is actinomorphic. The opposite would be, the other alternative is zygomorphic. And this is where you have bilateral symmetry, where you can't cut the flower in any direction and get a mirror image. You can only get a mirror image if you cut it straight down the middle. That's bilateral symmetry or zygomorphic. A great example would be the mint family, or orchids are this way as well. Another is asymmetrical, and these do not have any plane of symmetry. Floral insertion is another important term, and this has to do with the position of the ovary. And so where is the ovary attached in relationship to the other whorls of the flower? You can see in a superior ovary or a hypogynous ovary, the ovary is attached on the receptacle above the attachment for all the other whorls. For example, the sepals are attached below, the petals are attached below, the stamens are all attached below the site where the ovary is. That is a superior ovary. Perigynous refers to flowers that are kind of a happy in between. You'll see that the ovary wall can sometimes be fused to the sepals, so it looks kind of like a little cup in here. And the petals and the stamens seem to be attached kind of in the middle. This is called perigynous or half inferior. And then fully inferior ovaries are what we call epigynous. And the floral whorls are attached above. And so in this case, if you were looking into the flower, you wouldn't even be able to see the ovary. The ovary is completely enclosed in the green fleshy tissue below the receptacle. This is a great adaptation if you're a plant that gets pollinated by beetles, for example, where you would be worried about the tissue of the ovary being eaten by the insect that pollinates it. And plant families can be distinguished based on all of the characteristics I just described. So the number of floral whorls, the symmetry, and the floral insertion. And we'll be working using specific key sheets to help you identify these features before you begin to identify a plant so that you can more easily work through the key couplets. This is just an alternative illustration of the superior and inferior ovaries that you can review on your own. This is some images from a digitalflower.com where you can look at images of these different things. So this is like an actual example of a superior ovary. This is a broccoli flower from the Brassicaceae family. And you can see that you can totally see the ovary when you dissect the flower because all the floral parts are attached below it. This is an example of a perigynous. So this is that halfway in between superior and inferior. And you can see that the ovary is fused to the calyx wall here. Or it could be kind of the situation where you can see the ovary, but like it's deeply nested within this floral cup called a hypanthium. And this floral cup can often hold lots of nectar as a reward. This is a prunus flower. So like the Rosaceae is a great example of this in between superior inferior type of positioning of the ovary. Here's some examples of truly epigynous flowers or inferior. And again, this is another example from the Rosaceae family. So sometimes families can have multiple types of ovary positions, so that's important to recognize as well. Okay, we've reached the end of our mini lecture on floral terminology. I'd like you to check your understanding by drawing the following flower types from a side view and a top-down view. When you're done, keep this piece of paper as we're going to review these in class when we talk on Tuesday. I'd also like to say that when we get to class, I'll be reviewing the concept of floral formulas, which is a helpful way of coding the four worlds of a flower. So we'll also be discussing that in class. And the next thing you're going to do is watch a short video on vegetative morphology. Okay, thanks a lot.